Good morning. Please be seated. Welcome to Mayflower Congregational United Church of Christ, where we believe that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. Will you pray with me? Here are their names: Michael Thompson, Jerome Damon, Moses Rubin, Robert Lee Brown, Sadiq Idris, Gregory Frazier, Tyree King, Terrence Crutcher, Nicholas Glenn, Philip Hassan, Keith Lamont Scott. They are the black men shot and killed by police just in the month of September 2016. Forgive us, those who thought that there would be more names. Forgive us, those who thought it would be a shorter list. Isn't one too many? We have a problem, God. Let our response not be just to pray about it. Amen. Our scripture lesson this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets, they should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Here ends the reading of words inspired by God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
In the world of things we take for granted now but should not, Keith Scott of Charlotte, North Carolina, and Terrence Crutcher of Tulsa became the latest black men to be killed by police. If I were to read the whole list, not just for September, but for the whole year, I would be out of time for the sermon. We average 2 a week. Black men are 3 times more likely to be shot dead than whites, even though they are about 6% of the population. Meanwhile, just a few miles from where my mom lives, north of Seattle, another shooting in a mall, and in Syria, the city of Aleppo, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, it's a pile of rubble. And the suffering is so incomprehensible that to bear it, we choose not to watch the news at all, or we DVR it and fast forward through the Syria part. And by the way, those kids are not like a bowl of Skittles, a few of which will kill you, to quote Donald Trump Jr. They are not Skittles. They are kids like my kids are kids and your kids are kids and all kids are kids. In fact, what faces us all in a moment like this is that we will accept the unacceptable because confronting it is unbearable or discussing it too depressing. And yet look at the text that drops into the lap of the church this morning. Is that a coincidence? The Rich Man and Lazarus, which contains one of the most haunting lines in the New Testament, besides all this between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us. A great chasm. I don't know what you think of. I think of the Grand Canyon. I'm standing on the north rim, you're standing on the south rim, and it looks like an impossible thing that either of us should be able to pass from here to there. So the preacher in me can't help but ask, so what are the chasms that separate us now? Perhaps when the writer of Luke's gospel penned this parable, it was the gap between privilege and poverty, between the poor who are invisible to the rich and the rich who cannot understand the plight of the poor. Why don't they just work harder? Perhaps it's just an earlier cry that poor lives matter and that wealth can be spiritually debilitating. Perhaps it's a warning that one's religious tradition cannot be assumed to isolate them from accountability, because it can't. You can claim Moses, we can claim Jesus, but that doesn't guarantee that we're going to do anything differently in our lives, especially about the things that divide us, most of all, the chasm of race and class. Perhaps this parable is just a sad reminder that we can step over and around one another, but the problems don't go away, nor does our responsibility to do something about them. Chasms, they separate us, they define us, they also paralyze us. Oh wait, am I talking about first century chasms or 21st century chasms? Well, let's see. What about the gap between the rich and the poor? Is it a gap these days or a chasm? In his book, Who Stole the American Dream, Pulitzer Prize winner Hedrick Smith argues that the wealth of a few and the poverty of a growing number is our greatest chasm. We are two Americas, he writes, and a gross inequality of income and wealth has demolished the middle class. This was not inevitable, Smith says. It's not the result of impersonal and irresistible market forces. Rather, it's the consequence of government policies and corporate strategies. This is why it is so important to vote. So important, no matter how many reasons you can come up with why it doesn't matter. Because that apathy, by the way, is just another chasm that the rich and powerful would like to make sure we can never traverse. Our present gap between rich and poor is the largest in the history of the United States. And Oklahoma's criminal mismanagement, I'm choosing the word advisedly, of its state budget is not an accident brought on by the collapse of oil and gas prices, because state lawmakers were stepping over the body of Lazarus when times were good. It is a chasm that exists between those who have the power to run the world and then run it for their own enrichment, and those who don't and find themselves increasingly invisible. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist and author of The Price of Inequality, reveals some astonishing statistics about how much wealth is now concentrated in the hands of a few. It threatens the very nature of civil society, he writes. Our politics, our health care, our education, housing, employment, the legal system, all of it. It affects everything about the way we relate to one another. Increasingly, you can't get there from here. Well, let's see. Perhaps the parable is really about the universal tendency of human beings to assume that different is deficient. The rich man maybe sees Lazarus, but just sees something unclean and inconvenient. When a police helicopter was hovering above the scene of the shooting of Terrence Crutcher, an officer is heard to say, "Looks like a bad dude." How does he know that? How does he know that? He does not know Terrence Crutcher. He has no idea whether he's mentally ill or having a drug problem. He doesn't know what I just learned, for example, that Terrence Crutcher is the son of Dr. Joey Crutcher, a graduate of Phillips Theological Seminary, the alma mater of both your pastors. The officer in the helicopter only knows one thing, what he can see. It's not Terrence's behavior, hands up. It's not any aggressive move he's making, which leads the officer in the helicopter to this conclusion. No, all he can see is that he's a big black man, so he must be a bad dude. By some strange twist of fate, I don't know about my life sometimes or who's in charge of it, but I'm going to be lecturing and preaching in a Baptist church in Charlotte, North Carolina, 2 weeks from this morning. The trip's been planned for 2 years, but I did not imagine that I would go to Charlotte under these circumstances. The National Guard is still in Charlotte. I've contacted those who invited me and said, if you want to change the shape of that weekend or my participation, given what's happening, please let me know. I'll go along with whatever you think needs to happen. Maybe instead of regular church, we could just dismiss and visit some predominantly black church in Charlotte and then have ourselves a real conversation about race. That would be crossing a chasm. The rich man in this parable is often referred to, as you know, as Dives. Not because that name appears anywhere in the parable, but because Dives is Latin for rich man. And Jerome used that name for his late 4th century translation of the Bible, which was, of course, in Latin. There was a rich man. This is exactly how the parable right before this one begins, called the shrewd or dishonest manager, on which Lori preached last Sunday. I'm glad she drew that straw, because I'm not sure anyone's ever figured out what that parable is about. But it does end with a fairly clear imperative about people who love money. You can't serve God and wealth. That's fairly unambiguous. Jesus has no hesitation when it comes to talking about money, which is one of the least discussed subjects in church, except when it's time for pledges to come in. But seldom do we talk about wealth as something that slowly but surely can steal your soul, about how it can make you inhabit a gilded world where everything is designed to serve you, and you move through life in this bubble of privilege behind tinted glass. You know there are a lot of poor people out there, but mostly you step over or around them, or you have them moved. If they have sores on their bodies, like Lazarus, then you certainly don't touch them. Dogs come to lick the sores on Lazarus' body, a detail, by the way, that countless artists have included in their renderings of this parable. Then, of course, death comes to both men. Death, the great equalizer. Apparently, you really cannot take it with you. There are apparently no pockets in a shroud. And if you have done some plastic surgery during your life, well, you still die, but perhaps with fewer neck or eye wrinkles. The rich often do look better in their caskets, but as far as I can tell, they're just as dead. And in the great reversal of the parable, Lazarus is rewarded by being carried into the presence of Abraham, which is where we get that old Negro spiritual, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham. And Dives is sent to a place of torment, agony, and worst of all, regret, which is what I think hell is, dying with regret. In life, Lazarus begged the rich man for help, but now it's Dives who not only begs for a drop of water to cool his burning tongue, but to send a warning out to his family so they might avoid a similar fate. So this is a parable of judgment, not a parable of grace. There are both kinds in the Bible. Proving, as Fred Craddock used to say, that Jesus must have believed that in God's vocabulary there is the word no. Too late. Or, in this case, you can't get there from here. That is, the world is not going to heal itself unless you do something and I do something to heal it. It doesn't have to be a big, bold, newsworthy thing. It just has to be something. Perhaps if just once Dives had not just seen Lazarus, but realized him and said, "Hey, I see you lying here every day. I'm not sure we've even been properly introduced. I'm Dives. And as you can plainly see, I'm filthy rich." And Lazarus might have responded, "I'm Lazarus. And as you can see, I'm obviously not. But I don't wish to bother you, sir." And Dives would say, "You're not bothering me. Hey, are you Mary and Martha's brother?" No, different Lazarus. But I do like sharing that name. Perhaps one of these days, someone will raise me from the dead. And then what if, just what if, Dives had said, "Hey, I have too much of everything, and you have too little of everything. Why don't you join me at the table?" And what if Lazarus had said, I'm not dressed to sit at your table," and Dives said, "No, come on, come as you are." Lately, I've been intrigued by the struggle that seems to have fallen on the people of North Carolina. You notice a lot's happening there. From bad bathroom bills to voter suppression laws, the worst, to what is now called Moral Mondays. That's when a group of Charlotte clergy gather at the Capitol to remind the powers that be that Lazarus is everywhere and his numbers are growing. And this is not because there are more lazy people, but because unregulated, predatory capitalism and the greed that drives it is ruining this country. The leader of Moral Mondays is the Reverend Dr. William Barber. I hope very much to meet him when I'm in Charlotte in 2 weeks. He wrote an op-ed in yesterday's New York Times under the title, "Why We Are Protesting in Charlotte." Since the shooting death of Keith Scott, and with the release of more videos happening this morning, the Queen City, as Charlotte's called, has seen very violent protests, partly because people intent on doing violence came to Charlotte with no intention of being peaceful, and partly because the police used military tactics, including tear gas against protesters, and the resulting escalation has now cost one protester his life. But it was the raw truth-telling of Barber's op-ed that moved me, and I want to meet him. I think I'm going to stay over Monday and try to go to a Moral Monday if I can get my tickets changed. Here's what he wrote. Speaking on the campaign trail in Pittsburgh on Thursday, Donald J. Trump offered a grave assessment. Quote, "Our country looks bad to the world, especially when we're supposed to be the world's leader. How can we lead when we can't even control our own cities?" Mr. Trump seems to want Americans to believe, as Representative Robert Pittenger, a Republican whose district includes areas in Charlotte, told the BBC, that black protesters in the city, quote, "hate white people because white people are successful and they're not." But Charlotte's protests are not black people versus white people. They're not black people versus the police. The protesters are black, white, and brown people crying out against police brutality and systematic violence. If we can see them through the tear gas, they will show us a way forward to peace and justice, Barber wrote. On Thursday, he continued, "I joined 50 Charlotte area clergy members who were on the street this week. Yes, a few dozen provocateurs did damage property and throw objects at the police after being provoked by the officers' tear gas, rubber bullets, and military-style maneuvers. But as we saw, what you never see on TV, thousands more have peacefully demonstrated against the institutional violence in their communities." That systemic violence, which rarely makes headlines, creates the daily traumatic stress that puts our communities on edge, affecting both those of us who live here and outside observers who often denounce black-on-black crime. We cannot have a grown-up conversation about race in America until we acknowledge the violent conditions engendered by government policy and police practice. Anyone who's concerned about violence in Charlotte should note that no one declared a state of emergency when the city's schools were segregated, creating a school-to-prison pipeline for thousands of poor African American children. Few voiced outrage over the damage caused when 500,000 North Carolinians were denied health insurance because the legislature refused to expand Medicaid. When Charlotte's poor black neighborhoods were afflicted with disproportionate law enforcement during the so-called war on drugs, condemning a whole generation to bad credit and a lack of job opportunities, our elected officials did not call it violence. When immigration officers raid homes and snatch undocumented children from bus stops, they don't call it violence. But all these policies and practices do violence to the lives of thousands of Charlotte's residents. As a pastor and an organizer, I do not condone violent protest, but I must join the Charlotte demonstrators in condemning the systemic violence that threatened Mr. Scott's body long before an officer decided to use deadly force against him. And I must condemn the militarization of Charlotte by the authorities who do not want to address the fundamental concerns of protesters. For black lives to matter in encounters with police, they must also matter in public policy. In the scriptures, the prophet Jeremiah denounces false prophets for crying, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. We cannot condemn the violence of a small minority of protesters without also condemning the overwhelming violence that millions suffer every day. So, to conclude in my own words, let me say this. So wide is this chasm that divides us by race and class that we not only stare across it in disbelief, but we begin to see from a distance those on the other side as not fully human. Then it's easy for politicians to promise protection by building a wall, or by deporting the enemy, or closing the border and instituting a police state. So goes all empires that fail. Did you know first they promise a return of their greatness? It does not have to be. We can actually walk down one side of the Grand Canyon and across it and up the other side. It's a lot of work, and we have to be willing to take the first step. But when we get to the other side, we will find that what frightened us from a distance only compels our humanity up close. I don't know what we're going to do. Each of you has to find your own way of taking that first step. I, for one, have begun to say to African Americans I meet at school, at the Red Cup, or when I'm traveling, I just say, "I'm sorry." That's all I know to say. I'm sorry. And when they say, "For what?" I just say, "For everything."